how do you find love when your parents didn't? I think this will resonate with a lot of people who maybe were raised in homes where the parents are divorced, or maybe the parents stayed together and it was kind of a domestic dumpster fire, so to speak, in the home, even though they stayed intact. And a lot of young people who grow up through these families abandon hope. How do I even find love when I've never even seen it with my own eyes? And I think this kind of contributes to the rise in all the cohabitation rates. And I don't think it's because people don't take marriage seriously. I think it's because these cohabiting couples actually do take marriage seriously. And they're serious about it in the sense that I don't want to get divorced. I know what that meant to me to see my parents go through. And so I just want to make sure not to make the wrong choice. So we got to live together and then see if we're going to get married. And so a lot of people, I think, are going to resonate with the message of today's show of how to find love when your parents didn't. And so a longtime friend of the ministry, Joey Pontarelli, is going to be on, who has a ministry called Restored, helping people who've been through broken families find authentic, lasting love. Before we bring him on again, want to thank all the patrons who support this program. Thank you guys for making this happen. If you want to support our ministry, Chastity Project, it's a 501c3, so you can donate at chastity.com. That goes to the ministry. People that give through Patreon are basically supporting our family and this podcast that we do from home. And so if our ministry has been a blessing to you over the last 25 years or so, you want to give back, it's just a great way to support the family and the mission we're trying to do here with the podcast, Lust is Boring. And so if you want to support us, $5 a month or whatever, it's a huge gift to us. You just go to patreon.com/Jason Evert and you become a member of the community there. You get exclusive content. You're going to be getting early access to the podcast episodes, different things like that. Also want to thank our patron, our sponsor, Hallow. This May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and Hallow, one of the great things about that app is they're constantly churning out new content. And so this month, they've got new stuff on the app for people who struggle with mental illness, whether it's anxiety, body image issues, depression. A lot of people have mental health issues, think like, it's like 1 in 1,000 and I'm the one. It's like, no, this is a lot more broad than you think. So they've got content from a spiritual director on there, meditations to check out. So if you just go to hallow.com/lustisboring, you can try out the #1 Catholic prayer app in the world, which is Hallow. Also, before we get rolling, I want to announce there's a week and a half left if you want to register to join Father Agostino Torres and I for our pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And so only the registration closes on July 4th. And so if you want to have a vacation this summer, that's going to be a lot more than a vacation, but a pilgrimage. I think we've got 44 people going on the trip right now. There's still some room to fill out that first bus. So if you want to go, just go to chastity.com/pilgrimage. Click, you get the details there. Later in the summer, we're going to Poland to walk in the footsteps of John Paul II. And then we just launched a new pilgrimage that'll be on the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe to Mexico City, where we're going to go to get to see the Tilma on her feast day, and then also do some service work at an orphanage there in Mexico. And so if you want to join Father Agostino and I on that trip, likewise, go to chastity.com. You'll find the details there. Now, on to the show. Joey Pondarelli, give you a little background on him. As a child of divorce, Joey started Restored, his ministry to help young people from broken families. Restored offers the practical guidance and support that teens and young adults from broken families need to heal and to grow so they can feel whole again and break the cycle of dysfunction and divorce in their own lives. He's spoken across the U.S. and abroad. Joey's the author of the book, It's Not Your Fault, and his articles have been published by the Chastity Project, Focus, Culture Project, Shalom Tidings Magazine. Joey lives in Colorado with his wife, Bridget, and their 10-month-old daughter, Lucy. So, Joey, thank you for coming on the show with us today.
Hey, Jason, pleasure to be here.
Well, so people can get to know you. Can you give us a little background about yourself, kind of what brought you into this ministry, and a little bit about Restored?
Yeah, at the risk of sounding dramatic, I'd like to start on the most painful day of my life, which was the day that my parents separated. I'll never forget it. I was 11 years old. It was a warm spring day, and my mom set me and my siblings down to break the news that Dad would no longer be living with us. In fact, they were getting divorced. And immediately hearing that news, my whole world just shattered. As a boy, I didn't know what to do with that news, and so I just hid in the closet and I cried. And sitting there in that closet, I felt abandoned. I felt unwanted. I felt like I just wasn't good enough for my parents, because if I was, why wouldn't they make this work? And following that day, I dealt with all sorts of struggles. But to simplify it, I had emotional problems like loneliness, depression, dealt with relationship struggles, struggling to trust people, believing that love could actually last. And then finally, bad habits, like fell into pornography, using women. And honestly, that last one, pornography, it was honestly a way for me to numb the pain that I experienced in my family. Around the time where my parents split, a friend of mine introduced me to porn. And, immediately, like so many people before me have said, I felt like something was wrong with it, but I fell into it. And in time, again, I used it as a way to numb my pain. But in time, I realized, well, porn's not making me happy. And it isn't, even as a boy, even as an 11-year-old boy, I knew that I wanted to be happy. And so I needed to change. And two things really helped. One, got new friends. The sports buddies I was hanging around with weren't good for me. And so I met these new people who were actually really happy people. And I was kind of confused by that. I was like, I'm pretty miserable. Why are you guys so happy? And eventually I realized they were Catholics. And so I started to live my life like they did. I started to learn my faith, started to pray, started to build virtue, and that helped a ton. The second thing that really helped was hearing you speak. I was, freshman in high school when I heard you speak, and it absolutely changed my life. It was so helpful just to hear that, there's a way out of this misery of lust. There's a way to live a pure life that brings joy and brings peace into your life, where you can authentically love someone. And so I started to live that life and got porn out of my life for good, which was amazing, and just so much freedom, so much happiness came from that. So my life was better. But in time, I realized that I still felt broken. I still felt broken because I wanted love, I wanted freedom, I wanted happiness. But in pursuing them, I felt stuck. I felt held back by my own brokenness. And so I realized this principle that's true for all of us in life, and that is, after sin, the thing that holds us back most from becoming saints, becoming the best version of ourselves, is our untreated brokenness. And so I knew I needed to heal. So looked around for some help, for some sort of a resource, a book, a retreat, something to help a young person like me who came from a broken family. And I was shocked to find that there was nothing, at least nothing practical. Like, there's some academic research, but I didn't know any 16-year-old who was reading the Journal of Family Psychology. So I looked around for something practical, nothing. Part of the reason it was shocking to me too, I saw how my siblings were struggling. I saw how close friends of mine who were going through their parents' divorce were struggling, often in serious ways. And then I began reading the research, and I learned that each year, over 1 million American children go through their parents' divorce. That's according to the US Census. So right now, Jason, in America alone, there's tens of millions of people who've gone through the trauma of their family falling apart, and not even included in that number is people, like you said, who come from just really broken families, even though the parents do stick together, and there can be very similar effects. And so in time, after graduating from Franciscan University, working in the business world, I just felt a call to build resources for people like this to help them heal so they can feel whole again and go on and break that cycle of dysfunction and divorce. Because what happens so often is it just repeats for generation after generation. So like you said, we help teenagers and young adults who come from broken families to heal and grow so they can feel whole again and break that cycle.
That's awesome. Now, you had mentioned at the beginning, how you started to internalize some of the blame. Do you find that that's a pretty common thread through kids of divorce? Like, that's my fault. Like, if I had done this better, if I had been a better kid, if I had just done this, then my parents wouldn't be getting divorced. Or maybe even the parents outright blame the kids. Like, this is your fault. Do you find that's a common thread? And, how are kids who've been through this typically most influenced by their parents' divorce? More aside from just relationship stuff, we can dive into that next, but just personally, how do they tend to be most affected by the parents' divorce?
Yeah. So some of the things that I experienced are very typical, like emotional problems, whether that's anxiety, depression, loneliness, bad habits. Like a lot of the people we work with, maybe they're struggling with cutting or suicidal thoughts and tendencies. And those are just a few, but, relationship struggles, which we'll get into, are a huge one. But it's, using drugs, using alcohol, sleeping around, just basically trying to numb their pain in all the wrong ways. But going back to the point you made about them taking the blame, that's absolutely a very common occurrence. And it's a little confusing to someone who maybe hasn't experienced this, but I heard a dad reached out to me recently, and he said that, his wife was divorcing him. He didn't want the divorce, really difficult situation. And on the day where he was going to leave his house, he was in his bathroom just crying, just a mess. And his son came in, and he said, looked at his dad, and he said, "Dad, is this my fault?" And immediately the father just, wrapped him in his arms and said, no, this is not your fault. But for one reason or another, whether people blame us, a young woman came up to me after I spoke at a Focus event, and she was like, "Joey, I'm a college student now. My parents divorced 10 years ago. My dad to this day still blames me for the divorce." Like, how sad. And I don't think that's common, Jason, to be honest with you. But basically, the reason we blame ourselves, I think, is because in this chaotic situation that feels so out of control, if we take some form of responsibility, it can help us feel somewhat in control. And what psychologists have said too is that when we're forced to choose between our parents, the people who care for us, who do love us, even if they hurt us, and ourselves, we'll pretty much always choose to blame ourselves rather than them. So there's a lot there, some deep psychology, but yeah, there's certainly a lot of negative effects that come from this, and those are just a few.
Yeah, one thing that I tell young people that have internalized the blame, I try to flip it around of just like, okay, imagine your parents really, really loved each other. And were kind of all into their marriage, and they were pursuing each other. They're committed. They're loyal, just fiercely faithful to each other. Do you think you could break that up no matter how hard you tried? I mean, imagine you tried every trick in the book to actually break up your parents. You think you could possibly rupture that authentic bond? And I think about it as like, no, I guess I couldn't. I mean, if they really loved each other, no kid would have that power over that relationship. And I think that helps them to realize, like, okay, maybe the issue isn't me. Maybe this is them projecting their issues on me, of just like, I got to get the fault out of me. And you seem like a good scapegoat. You brought all this stress into our marriage, and like it's your fault. So that's the way I try to turn the tables on the kids, of just like, imagine if you were actually plotting against your parents' marriage. If they loved each other, it'd be bulletproof. I mean, it really would. Now, when these young people, come out of these situations, whether it's a divorce or a dysfunctional family, how do you find that that's handicapping them, so to speak, in their own relationships and the young people that you've been serving?
Yeah, so the biggest area of their lives that's impacted by their broken family is certainly their relationships. And just to explain the background on that, we got to go into some research. So there was a researcher at the University of California at Berkeley, not exactly a conservative stronghold, but she was really obsessed with this question, like, how are these young people who come from these divorced families affected, and how are they most affected? So she studied children of divorce for 25 years. And what she did is she took 131 children from 60 families and observed them for 25 years. She reported all her findings in a great book, if people want to go deeper, called The Unexpected Legacy of Divorce. And a few important footnotes. She only chose children who didn't have any developmental or emotional problems prior to the divorce. And then she observed the effects that the divorce had on them and compared them to their peers who came from intact families. And going into the research, she actually expected to find, this is kind of the common thought at the time and even now, she expected to find that they weren't affected at all. And if they were affected by their parents' divorce, the effects would just be short-lived. They'd be temporary. Yeah. But after years of studying this on a deep level, she said, our findings challenge the myth that divorce is a transient crisis, and that as soon as parents reestablish their lives, the children will recover fully. That doesn't happen. And some of her research, what she found, among other things, is that children of divorce were less likely to get married. They're more likely to get divorced. They were less likely to have children. And the men, interestingly, were far less likely to even enter in an intimate relationship. They wanted nothing to do with it. So two main takeaways from her research. One, she said that the full effects from your parents' divorce actually aren't experienced until adulthood. They come out more, they surface more in adulthood. And the area of our lives where they come out the most is in our romantic relationships, and especially in our own marriage. Now, people might be wondering, why exactly is that? It's pretty simple. We lack a roadmap for love. We've seen a very broken model of love and marriage because more than anyone, our parents teach us how to love and how to build a marriage. It's even ingrained in us down to our bones. And so if that was not helpful and perhaps even harmful, then we really struggle when it's our turn because we feel kind of lost. We don't know how to go about building love that actually lasts. And so to illustrate that point, there was a woman who reached out to me not long ago. I call her Mary, and she said that as a little girl, she would watch her parents fight all the time. Her parents' marriage was a mess, a lot of dysfunction. They really needed help, but they never did much to fix or heal their marriage. And so the dysfunction continued on for years. Fast forward to when Mary was in high school, her mom came to her and she said, hey, I want to divorce your dad. Mary didn't really know what to say to that, so she just told her, I just want the fighting to stop. Her mom goes through with the divorce, and what honestly seemed, Jason, like a solution to a really messy situation, just made things worse for Mary. It was one problem on top of another, one trauma on top of another. Now, Mary said that up to that point, she just kind of held her pain inside. She didn't really act out. But that all changed when she got off to college. She got into the party scene. She started drinking heavily. That led to dating the wrong guy. She ended up marrying one of those guys who was a drug addict and an alcoholic. Their marriage was a mess as well. Now they get pregnant. Because Mary's terrified that her baby's going to grow up in this hell, she got an abortion. Obviously brought a ton more pain into her life. And after that, she divorced her husband, repeating the cycle started by her parents, which is so common. And once the dust settled, she fell into a deep depression. She still deals with emotional issues to this day. So her story, as tragic as it is, confirms these findings that, adulthood is where these effects come out the most and our relationships are most affected. Whenever I think of Mary, maybe someone listening right now, maybe that's your story. Maybe you're in a really rough spot because of the trauma you've endured, the broken family you come from. I can't help but think, what if? Like, what if someone was there to help Mary learn how to deal with her pain in healthy ways instead of unhealthy ways, to get professional help, to learn how to heal, to, learn how to build love? I can't help but think that her life would not have become the tragedy that it did.
Yeah. So the $1 million question for somebody like that, or somebody listening who's in that situation, okay, been through the garbage, been through the trauma, been through all this, like, what can I actually do specifically? I'm not married. I'm not engaged yet. I'm not even dating anybody. What can I do right now to actually build a solid marriage before marriage even happens? Instead of just kind of fearing it, in a sense of just like, I don't want to even hope for that because I've seen what that looks like, and you're just going to get used and you're going to get walked all over and you're just going to get trashed. I mean, I know some people that growing up said, I'm never going to get divorced, and I know how to have 100% bulletproof divorce avoidance, and that's just don't get married. Because if I never marry, I can never get divorced. And so, boom, I'm safe. And so instead of people kind of giving into that relational despair, what would you give, or just some solid tips of like, how do I save my marriage before it starts? How do I find love, as the show says, when my parents didn't?
Yeah, they just need to listen to you, man.
Yeah, no, yeah, right.
No, it's a great question. And some of the things I want to offer are not just me making them up on the spot. This is from research. It's from the church's wisdom. It's from couples who've actually done it. I'm only, 4 years into my marriage now, so I'm still a baby husband. But there's a lot of good stuff out there if you pay attention. So one, I would say it's so basic, so simple, Jason, that people listening are probably going to write it off. And that is build virtue. Build virtue. Why is that so important? If you want a great marriage, it starts with you. It has nothing to do with your spouse, nothing to do with your relationship. Because what I've learned, and this is absolutely true, that you are the lid on your marriage. Your marriage will only be as healthy, happy, and holy as you are individually, and eventually your spouse too. And what I've learned from the great marriages I've been blessed to know and somewhat study is that the more virtuous the spouse is, the happier the marriage. Always. Yeah. And so how do we build virtue? That's another talk for another time. But one thing I would recommend is focus on one at a time, maybe one per week, and then try to systemize it a little bit. I know this is going to sound super nerdy, but set a reminder on your phone for Sunday, let's say, and then pick a virtue that you want to work on that week. And then, set other reminders, maybe to remind you each day of the week so that okay, I'm going to try to practice this virtue in particular all these days. When you go to bed at night, do a little examination of conscience, think about, well, how did I do with that? Make a plan to make some improvements so you can better practice that virtue the next day. In the morning, just ask God for the grace when you're saying your morning prayers to live out that virtue in your life. So that's a little tip on building virtue. Another tip I would say is set healthy expectations for marriage. Again, something that seems kind of simple, but researchers have found that if you want a great marriage, one of the essential ingredients is setting healthy expectations for your marriage. And to illustrate this point, perhaps your listeners have heard of the Paris syndrome. This is a psychological condition where when tourists go to Paris, France, they experience extreme shock, disappointment, and other symptoms. Now, it sounds like a joke. It's not. It's been documented by medical journals. What's going on here? Basically, these tourists had built up in their minds this romantic idea of Paris, France. And when they actually went there, the messy reality of France was so disappointed that they had to be flown home and they had to see a doctor.
Oh, boy.
In a similar way, if we go into marriage with these unhealthy expectations, it's going to cause a lot of problems. John Paul II in the jeweler's shop, he said that disappointment leads to bitterness, and bitterness, of course, will really damage your marriage. So, how do you do that? A couple of tips. One, I would say, try to identify the unhealthy expectations you have. How do you do that? I would say try to put them into words. Like, especially, maybe marriage is years off, but think about, like, what do you want your marriage to actually be like? What are you going to do on the weekends? What is, life going to look like in the evenings? How do you want your spouse to treat you, and so on? Like, try to get really clear on that, because a lot of us say, hey, yeah, I want a great marriage. What does that mean? What does that practically look like? So try to put that into words, and then you can identify the unhealthy expectations that you might have and replace those with healthy expectations. Another tip is to spend time with great marriages, like healthy marriages. If you know someone, build a relationship with them, build a relationship with that family, spend some time with them if you can. Maybe you can help them out around the house or go over for dinner from time to time. This has been so helpful for me, especially coming from a broken family. There are two couples that were just so helpful. They inspired me to pursue love in the first place, because I doubted that it could even last. And their example kind of gave me a roadmap too on how to do that. Not saying I'm an expert at it, I'm working on it still, but it certainly was super, super helpful. And then the final point I would say is learn to handle conflict well. In any close relationship, but especially in marriage. Jason, I know you would agree with this. Conflict is inevitable. And the point is not to avoid conflict. A lot of times we think that's the point. It's not. That's not the goal. The goal is to make conflict healthy, because if there's no conflict in your marriage, it usually means one of two things. You're either a saint or something's off. And so the goal is to make conflict healthy. How do you do that? Two quick things that experts say. One, pick your battles. Like, this has been so helpful in my own marriage. Like, extend grace, let the little things go. Like, obviously, if there's a big issue with your spouse, you need to talk about it. Like, definitely bring that up. But if there's small things like little annoyances, you can let those things go. It's going to really help your marriage. Sometimes you got to let those small fires burn. And then finally, use this tactic that my marriage counselor, my wife and I have been to marriage counseling, he taught us, and this is, it's this. You can call it timeout. And so what that means is basically, in the midst of conflict, when things are getting pretty intense and emotional, one of you just calls a timeout. And how this works is, in advance of that fight, like way prior to it, you set a time anywhere from 30 minutes to 24 hours where you say that's your typical timeout, the default timeout. And so in the midst of a conflict, one of you calls a timeout. The person who calls the timeout is the one who keeps the time. Let's say it's for an hour. You guys go separate ways, kind of cool down. And then in an hour, the person who called the timeout then resumes the conversation as well. This is so helpful because then your emotions can settle. Our counselor taught us that when you're emotional, when you're angry, your IQ drops by about 30 points. So for those of us who are like in an average of 100, that puts us in the 70 range, which psychologists say is the range of, well, they say mental retardation, but mental disability, just to be a little politically correct. So those are a few tips that you can use to hopefully build a great marriage. There's a lot more that can be said, but hopefully those help.
Yeah, I've heard it neurologically that when men argue, we actually only use half of our brain. I said that once in a classroom, and girls like, well, that sounds right. And one boy was like, yeah, we want to make it fair. And I'm like, hey guys, come on, break it up. So in terms of that, one follow-up point and then a question, follow-up point in terms of idealizing marriage. I would say sometimes people take it a step further and they idolize marriage, that, in a sense that as a church, we're given 7 sacraments, but you're actually only allowed to worship one of them. The Blessed Sacrament. And what we end up doing is we end up worshiping more than one. We start worshiping marriage in the sense of like, once I get there, it's going to fulfill all of my emotional needs. And people don't only do this with marriage, they do it with dating. When I get a boyfriend, then finally I'm going to have, this joy. Like, we're waiting to be happy when we have that thing. But if we're not happy as we are, and if you don't learn how to make yourself happy as a human being when you're single, then your happiness will always be contingent upon the other person. And that's too great a burden for anyone to bear. Like, it's not, as weird as it sounds, a wife's job to make her husband happy. It's not a husband's job to make his wife happy. Like, it's their own job to make themselves happy and bring that joy into the marriage. Now, this is not to say that you should disregard the spouse. Well, that's your deal. You go make yourself happy. But, you want to make their joy part of your responsibility. But when you just leave it up to the other, hey, I'm grumpy, it's always your fault. Obviously, that leads to conflict. And so my lead-in question then would be, any more tips in terms of conflict resolution? Because, like, let's say there's, people listen to this and are like, look, my parents had like 8-year-old conflict resolution skills, and they're 48 years old. I never saw that. Okay. We take a timeout. Okay. But then the timeout's got to end. Now I've got to talk, maybe it's not 120 degrees. It's maybe 95 now, but tensions are still a little bit high. How do I make sure I'm getting my points across or I'm listening well? Any other conflict resolution tips you'd throw in?
Yes, no, great question. So one of them that I had to learn is like stop trying to be so defensive. And I'm still working on this, Jason. Like I'll be honest with you, I've made some progress, but it's hard. So often we want to go into a situation where there's conflict and win.
Yeah.
And Jordan Peterson had a great point on that. He's like, if you win all these arguments, that means your spouse is a loser, and who wants to be married to a loser? I think that's
So
a
you
good
be the
point.
loser. Yeah.
Exactly. So, and there's a balance. So you don't want to be a complete doormat. That's not the point here. But some humility goes a long way in these conversations. So one of the things that my wife prefers in these arguments is like, don't explain yourself now. It just sounds like an excuse. Just apologize for what the issue, and then later we can have that conversation. That's what our marriage counselor recommended. So I know it's so tempting to be like, but this is why I did this, and it wasn't that bad, and. But it can be really helpful just delay that a little bit, and that's hard to do when you're emotional. But if you can do that, it's really going to help you. Another thing is, counselors teach to use like I statements. So you can say, I feel this way, or when you do this, this is like a typical conversation, like a sentence structure you can use. When this happens, I felt this way, because you did that. And so in a way, you're kind of making it more about you than about them. You're not just pointing the finger. You're just saying, hey, this really affected me in this way. So, but underneath that, if it's okay, the most important thing to do to handle conflict well is actually to just make your marriage really healthy. And when we went to counseling for the first time, I expected the counselor to kind of teach us these tactics on how to navigate conflict, like we were in a FBI negotiation. But what he did was he just wanted to know, how is the overall health of your marriage? Are you guys going on dates? Are you having fun together? Are you praying together? Are you having deep conversations? Because if you can strengthen the foundation of your marriage, then all those other issues are either going to go away or they're going to be so much easier to handle. And so, this principle of like, don't just focus on fixing things that break, but making things go right, kind of being more preemptive and making your marriage healthier. But there's a lot of other things out there that experts say when it comes to conflict, but those are just a few.
Those are good points. So one reminder, like, don't give the faux apologies. Like, I'm sorry that you feel hurt by what you think that I said. It's just like, it ain't gonna work. Okay, so no faux apologies. And I think some of the relational advice applies to parenting, because as you're talking, I'm thinking like, when I'm spending quality time with my kids, down to the dock fishing or going out in the woods or doing this or that, and we've got that time, discipline's easier at home. It's like, we built that relationship. We just spent 4 hours fishing and catching bass and doing this thing. We get home and now I want you to, empty the dishwasher. They tend to be so much more cooperative, like when there's a relationship that exists, as opposed to like, okay, I just read 50 books on parenting and I'm not connected to you at all. And now I want you to do these things with my relationship communication skills I've developed from these 18 books. It's like, it ain't gonna work. And so sometimes we got to kind of put you could have all the relationship advice in the world, but if you don't have a relationship, it's like, just, I don't know, it's just like good luck in implementing that stuff. Now,
Absolutely.
to play devil's advocate to some of this stuff in terms of the divorce, the narrative that follows, I spoke with a wife this week who was in an abusive marriage, and it became very painfully obvious to her, like, I have to get out. I mean, for the well-being of my kids, like, I can't stay in this thing. And now in the process of going through an annulment, I remember once hearing a priest, super solid priest. I mean, he's not kind of just like, oh, if you're not getting along, just call it over. But he's like, I knew of a husband, he had 10 kids and ended up getting a divorce, the annulment, and the children say it is the best thing that ever happened to their family, that the parents went their separate ways. These things kind of throw a wrench into the equation of just like, it's divorce always bad, stick together always good. How do we know when there's exceptions to this? How do we know when, perhaps the couple entered into a marriage that was not valid and is very dysfunctional, and it would be better, maybe they try all the counseling in the world, doesn't make a dent in it. And could it ever be beneficial for the kids? How does a couple even discern? Sometimes with physical abuse, I think it's kind of obvious. Okay, he's drunk and hitting the kids, or he's sexually abusing them. Okay, black and white, get out, at least in terms of a separation, then discern. How about the gray areas when it's more emotional abuse? Like, when's the tipping point? How much is too much? Is it like, okay, well, this marriage will survive the extent everybody just gets abused and then we stick together? So I mean, it's a big question there, kind of loaded, but maybe for a person who finds himself in that situation, what are some discernment tips they can take in terms of what is in the end goal of the well-being of the family, of the spouses? How do you always discern through that? So a big, tough question, but want to throw that one out where to be devil's advocate.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's an important one to talk about. So there's a few things to address here. One, if you're in danger, like maybe you're listening to this right now and your spouse is abusing you, or you're in a really bad, dangerous situation in your marriage, the church always says get to safety. Jason, it really should be a no-brainer, but sometimes we have to speak out about this. You need to get to safety. And typically what that means is leaving the house, going to stay with a family member, staying with a friend, get to safety. So I can't stress that enough. Now, when it comes to those tricky situations of what exactly is abuse, maybe a little bit above my pay grade to actually answer that. But I will say this, there is a balance there, and maybe someone who walks with a couple who's really going through struggles can help make a better decision about that. But at the risk of maybe ticking some people off, I just want to say this. In some scenarios, these are not all, in some scenarios, the world, I think, would have us believe that any sort of conflict is, abuse, or any sort of conflict is unhealthy. And again, there's a balance there, because there is such a thing as verbal abuse, emotional abuse. Those are very real things. But, if our husband maybe gets a little bit, the husband maybe gets a little bit frustrated at times, or the wife says something she shouldn't have said at one point, and it's not a continuous struggle, it's not a continuous trend, we need to be careful about calling that abuse, because I think it does disservice to the people who are especially going through very serious abuse. And again, I'm not making light of those situations. Those are real. So when it comes to divorce, sometimes that's necessary. There's kind of two routes you can go with it. One's a legal separation, and one is, the civil divorce. Now, that has nothing to do with the actual marriage bond, especially if you're in a sacramental marriage. Those are two separate things: a legal contract, which is more of a government document, versus the actual marriage bond, which is this deep spiritual reality. And so if you need to go through that divorce, there's a difference between going through it for the purpose of protecting your children and you, versus kind of getting out of your commitment. And sadly, the majority of cases, I would say, are, and maybe not in the Catholic Church, but it could be true there too, are people who they want to be with someone else, or they're kind of sick of being married and they want to pursue their dreams and their happiness elsewhere. And so we need to speak out against that. That's really damaging. What the Catechism says about this, I pull up the quote here. It said, divorce, speaking about that situation where divorce is used as kind of an escape from your vows, divorce is a grave offense against natural law. Divorce is immoral also because it introduces disorder into the family and into society. This disorder brings grave harm to the deserted spouse, to children traumatized by the separation of their parents and often torn between them, and because of its contagious effect, which makes it truly a plague on society. That's 2384 to 2385. And the Code of Canon Law has some insight here too, some great guidance. And basically, if the spouses can't be together because of one of these situations, extreme conflict, a lot of maybe abuse, or this danger for the children where they could lose their life, or maybe they're exposed to drugs and things like that. In that situation, the Code of Canon Law says this, not to get too nerdy here, but 1153, it says this: if either of the spouses causes grave mental or physical danger to the other spouse or to the offspring, or otherwise renders common life too difficult, that spouse gives the other a legitimate cause for leaving, either by decree of the local ordinary, your bishop, or even on his or her own authority if there is danger in delay. So that's 1153 of the Code of Canon Law. It goes on to say, in all cases, when the cause for separation ceases, conjugal living must be restored. So with that, the goal is always to bring the family back together, the spouses back together. Now, are we going to be unrealistic with this? Sometimes that's not possible. And so in those cases, John Paul II said, these are perhaps the most heroic people ever, the ones who, in a valid marriage, they stay true to their wedding vows, even though their spouse does not. Mm-hmm. What a cross to bear. I cannot imagine that. But John Paul II said, as a church, we need to love these people, we need to support them, and they are truly heroic. So I don't know if that fully answers your question. It's a
Yeah.
tough one. It's something that probably deserves its own episode, but
Yeah.
hopefully that helps a little bit with some guidance.
Yeah, yeah, and if you're listening, and you're puzzled. Okay, these are helpful, but try not to decide it on your own. You can kind of get paralyzed and just stuck. Talk to your pastor, talk to spiritual director, talk to friends, family. Just don't get isolated. And then I think if you're talking to the right people whose opinions you respect and admire, people of prayer, hopefully there'll be a consistent theme in what they're kind of advising of just like, no, this is kind of a bump in the road and try this and try that. Or just like, no, this has been chronic and it's just worsening. And so if nothing changes, nothing is going to change. And so you need to make a more drastic step for a reparative hope. Kind of like Archbishop Cordileone telling Nancy Pelosi, no more Holy Communion. The idea of that separation, so to speak, is to be a wake-up call. It's supposed to be medicinal in its effect, to wake you up, to spur repentance in your heart, not shame or making the sacrament some badge you need to earn by a perfect life, but like in a grave situation, sometimes that type of separation can be the wake-up call that a person needs. Now, in wrapping things up, if somebody's listened to this, and they're single and their parents' relationship was a mess, and they've just kind of thrown in the towel, kind of given up hope of just like, look, I'm going to live in an apartment with 12 cats and be happy by myself. Why complicate my life with love? Or, hey, I'll have girlfriends, but once things get too serious, I'm calling it off. Somebody that's formed kind of a protective shield around themselves to protect themselves from vulnerability. And that shield's become a bit of a coffin to them, a cage, a prison. To somebody who's kind of given up hope on love, what would you say to maybe kind of ignite that spark of hope again in them?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing, I get it. Like, honestly, I get it. I've been there. I really struggle to believe that love and marriage could last, at least for me. And so I was terrified of love. I was terrified of relationships. I was terrified of, even pursuing women when it got to the point in my life where I started dating. It was just so scary to me because I did not want to repeat what I saw in my parents' marriage. And so the second thing I would say is, like, I get it. The first thing, I get it. The second thing is, there's actually nothing wrong with you for feeling that way. Like, it makes sense given what you've been through in this culture where you left and right, you can see miserable marriages. You can see marriages breaking apart, especially if you come from a broken family. There's nothing weird for feeling this way. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, in his great book, Man's Search for Meaning, he said, an abnormal response to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. In other words, you come from brokenness, you don't want to repeat that. Totally makes sense. Makes sense that you're afraid, that you don't want to go down that route. But even through your fear, even through your doubts, my challenge would be this: take action. Pay attention to that voice in your heart, to that desire in your heart that you have for authentic love. That won't be satisfied by those 12 cats. That won't be satisfied by you just running away from love your whole life. And so take small steps. Take small steps toward authentic love. For me, what that looked like was, because I was so afraid of love and vulnerability, I started being vulnerable in my friendships. Now, they were a little safer than maybe a dating relationship, which could end. And so I started doing that. That helped a ton, kind of built that muscle so that by the time I started dating, I was able to be more vulnerable with the women I was dating. So I just acted in spite of my fear. I still felt afraid when I was going through it. But by taking those steps, I was able to overcome that to the point where now, not that I've reached some pinnacle, but, I'm a married man. I have a baby girl who I just love with all my heart. Being a dad's like the best thing. It's hard to explain that to people who aren't parents yet, but it's just, I'm so amazing. And so it's worth it. All those struggles, fighting through those fears, fighting through those doubts, it is worth it to find authentic love. So that would be my challenge. She was like, take action. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of your fear. And so let that desire lead you. Look up to couples, find a mentor who can show you like, hey, no, love is possible. It's possible for you to have a really beautiful, beautiful marriage. And again, you're going to wake up one day and realize that, wow, I've been able to build something really beautiful. And one final thing I would just say is, for those of you who come from broken families, just know that you're not doomed to repeat your parents' mistakes. You're not doomed to repeat your family's dysfunction. You can write your own story. You can really build something beautiful. And there's tons of people out there who are doing that right now. Like Jason, Crystalina is one of them. She's fought through so much fear, so many struggles, so much brokenness in her life to be able to now. How many kids do you guys have at this point?
8.
Beautiful. You know, it's like, did she believe at some point that she could ever have that? Probably not. But now she does. And so it's totally worth it. And so I would encourage you to look to people like that who can prove to you that love is worth the risk. It's worth the struggle. It's worth fighting through all of that and pursuing it, because, you know, there's nothing that satisfies like authentic love.
Yeah. One thing I try to think of is, think of the end game. Think of, okay, if my end game is to be safe and not brokenhearted, imagine we cling to that as the goal. And then you're 80 years old and on your deathbed. Like, are you really going to be like, dude, I made it? No one broke my heart. I was unbreakable. To me, that wouldn't be of just like, hey, this is the finish line. I mean, to become unbreakable really shouldn't be the goal, to just be bulletproof, so to speak, because you're created by love and for love, and love requires the thing you fear the most, which is vulnerability. And we're not saying that everybody's called to get married. Like,
Sure.
No, I mean, obviously not. I mean, some people are called to singleness. Some are called to religious life, priesthood. You could be a consecrated virgin, whatever. But, I just want to make sure that people aren't making vocational choices out of despair or fear or shame or whatever, of thinking like, well, I have to become a priest because if I don't go to the seminary, then I'm not giving God everything. That's kind of out of shame. Or people saying, I'm not going to get married because then I'm going to get just walked all over like my mom was. So that's not the calling for me. So, right. Yeah, I mean, maybe priesthood or married life might not be your calling, but just make sure you're making the vocational choice not based on fear, of it failing. Because to me, that ends up just being despair. And then you follow that to the logical conclusion at the very end. And it's not going to be a place of contentment to me. It's going to be a place of, man, if I could have that lifetime back, could I have been a little bit more vulnerable? Could I have given love a shot? I think there'd be regret at the end. And so to me, the regret isn't getting your heart broken. The regret is keeping it kind of locked up where it can never be broken. So now, Joey, how can people get a hold of you, get in touch with your ministry, listen to some of your talks, kind of get plugged into the work that you're doing if they want to dive deeper?
Yeah. I'll mention a few resources if that's okay. So everything can be found at our website, restoredministry.com. Ministry is singular, restoredministry.com. We have a podcast. It's called Restored, Helping Children of Divorce. We bring on experts to offer really practical advice on how to heal, how to grow. We bring on people who share their stories of what worked for them to heal and grow, especially from the trauma of coming from a broken family. Jason, you've been on this show. We've had Dr. Bob Schutz. We've had the Cerise. We've had the Swaffers. We've had Father John Burns, Chris Stefanik, all these great guests. So go to restoredministry.com/podcast, or just listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts. The book you mentioned, It's Not Your Fault, a practical guide to navigating the pain and problems from your parents' divorce. So that was just this resource we needed to put together to get out to young people who came from broken families. And it just answers 33 questions on the most common, most pressing challenges faced by young people who come from broken families. And so if you want to check that out, it's on Amazon. You can get the first chapters for free at restoredministry.com/books. And then finally, we have a free PDF that we give away. It's 7 tips to build a thriving and divorce-proof marriage. And there's a 60-minute talk that comes along with that one. And that talk is a super practical talk on building a great marriage. And it actually goes beyond a chastity talk. It's kind of a complement to a chastity talk, because, as you know, chastity is so important to build authentic love, but it's not the only skill that you need. It's not the only virtue that you need. I like to think of it as the foundation of a home. There's more to build above the surface. And so that's what that talk focuses on. It's based on research, psychological research, on the church's wisdom, on really beautiful couples who've built amazing marriages. So check that out. You can get that free download and the talk at restoredministry.com/marriage talk. Again, restoredministry.com/marriage talk.
Okay, and I'll put that link in the show notes so people just kind of click straight on it and get all that content. And then you had mentioned earlier in the show the effects of pornography in your life. So I want to make sure before we close, putting a plug in for Exodus 90 and also Covenant Eyes. CovenantEyes.com, I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's an artificial intelligence screen-based porn filter that you can put on the computers, on the screens, on the cell phones. You get a daily report as parents or as spouses. So if it's a husband struggling with this thing, or, maybe you're single and you want to get porn out of your life because you know that that's going to be toxic to your future marriage, go to CovenantEyes.com, check this thing out. You can click the link in the show notes to try it out for free for a month. You just use the promo code CHASTITY chastity. And so I would recommend that. And they're a generous sponsor of the program. And then also Exodus 90. I don't know if you've done it. I got to do Exodus 90 once. 90 days kicks you in the pants. Just a detox of all of this stuff. Because, in terms of what do I do to get ready for my vocation, I'd recommend the guys try Exodus 90. It's just 3 months of asceticism, brotherhood, prayer, and it drudges up a lot of stuff. And it just shows you maybe there's a lot of unnecessary attachments in your life that need to be kind of pruned off of your life for you to be the man that God's kind of created you to be. And so between Exodus 90 and Covenant Eyes, I think they're good resources that kind of tie into well to the stuff that we're discussing. And, as I mentioned at the top of the show, if you want to go with us on pilgrimages, go to chastity.com or support us on Patreon. All the links are below. But I would just ask all the listeners, please pray for Joey, for his ministry and all the good work that he's doing, for his wife, their little 10-month-old baby girl. And Joey, God bless you. Thank you, and keep up the great work.
Thanks so much, Jason. Can I say one final thing?
Oh, please do.
Yeah, I just want to say, if there's people out there listening right now who've been listening to the podcast for a while, and maybe you're like me, where you heard Jason speak years ago, it really impacted your life, maybe even set your life in a totally different trajectory to where you wouldn't be where you are today, support this ministry. Go on Patreon, support this ministry. You can start as low as $5 a month. So like Jason said, you just click the link to Patreon, you pick the level, you can start as low as $5 a month. You put in some basic info like your name, your email address, and then you add your payment method and you're done. It's like 90 seconds. So go ahead and do that, because it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of money to produce content like this, to reach young people who really are dying for this message. And I really believe that if we can help people build beautiful marriages, help people live pure lives, help people fulfill their vocations, we're going to change our culture from the broken culture that it is into a Catholic culture where the human person flourishes and souls are saved. And there's nothing more important. So I just wanted to challenge you all who've been maybe listening for a while, haven't done that. Just go to the page, look at it, see what you can do. And I think we all could afford $5 a month. So I hope that's helpful. And thanks so much for all the great work you guys do, Jason.
No, I appreciate that, Joey. And like you said, families not only can change the culture, it's the only thing that can change the culture. I mean, God through the family is the means by which I think he wants to restore the mess that all of us are in. And it doesn't mean you have a perfect family, perfect marriage. Nobody's got that. But if we can just open our brokenness to the heart of Jesus and let him kind of enter into that space, then God can do wonderful things through us like he's doing through you. So God bless you, Joey. Keep up the awesome work.
Amen. Likewise. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.